Before we begin, I just wanted to make a quick note that the sections that you're looking for, whether that's baby, woman, or man, are timestamped in the description. Chapter 7, The Lead Coffin People. As the team had suspected, the small coffin contained the skeleton of a child. In the 17th century Chesapeake area, death was an ever-present fact of life, especially for children, who were particularly vulnerable to disease and starvation. 1/4 of all of the children born in Maryland during this period died during the first year of life. Of the survivors, almost half died before they turned 20. For a child to have 4 living grandparents was rare. In fact, a colonial child could expect that at least one parent, and maybe both, would die before that child grew up. As a result of the high death rate, remarriage and step-families were very common. Most of the lead coffin child's bones seemed to be in good to excellent condition, a surprise given that the fragile bones of children often decay rapidly. But the coffin also contained a mystery. The child's lower leg bones and feet were gone. Had they somehow been severed by an injury? Could such an event have been the cause of death? As Doug Owsley and Carrie Brewelhide investigated further, they saw green stains left by copper shroud pins on the skull, the collarbone, the jaw, and a rib. Then, conservators pointed out yet another amazing discovery: tiny fragments of the linen material that the St. Mary city woman had used to shroud the child. Traditionally, English women prepared the dead for burial. Fabric from 17th century colonial barriers rarely survives the effects of time and decomposition. Occasionally, however, some fragments do. The lead coffin linen fragments were most likely preserved by the shroud pins, and a fascinating example of the way the circumstances of a burial affect what remains, and does not, centuries later. As Silas Hurry, the director of the archaeology laboratory at St. Mary City, explained, copper is a fairly toxic or poisonous metal. When there are copper pins in contact with fabric, critters, insects, fungi, and microscopic organisms, don't eat the cloth in contact with the copper. As the copper corrodes or decays, the fabric strands around it are preserved, almost like a fossil. Wondering how old the child had been, Browelhide turned her attention to the cranium. Children's smaller craniums can also offer detailed information about a person's age at the time of death. An adult human skull is made of 28 bones, which includes the 6 ear bones. The bones of an adult's cranium are solidly fused together. At birth, however, an infant's skull needs to have a degree of flexibility to pass through the birth canal without being damaged. Further flexibility is needed as the infant grows and the skull changes. Thus, the bones of an infant's cranium are not fused together. Instead, fibrous joints called sutures fill the spaces between the bones. Sutures appear on the cranium as zigzagging lines. They're easy to see on the skulls of children, teenagers, and young adults. As a person gets older, the suture lines often become more intricate. This holds the cranium's bones more tightly together. Some of the sutures on the skull of an elderly person may fade and disappear completely. Thus, a forensic anthropology can study sutures to estimate a person's age. In this way, Browelhide determined that the child was very young, no more than a toddler. But how young? Browelhide believed that the teeth might reveal the answer to that question, so she examined the child's mandible, or jaw. She saw that the height of 2 incisors indicated that they had partly grown in while the child was alive. A baby's first incisors usually start to come in when the child is between 4 and 6 months old. The rest of the child's teeth had not yet formed. Based on these facts, Browelhide estimated the child had been 5 to 6 months old at death. Only a baby. As Owsley and Browelhide conducted their examinations, other team members studied the tiny coffin and the rest of its contents. The tiny coffin proved to have been built at a different time than the other two. 3 pieces of lead had been used in its manufacture. Careful comparison showed that they were not leftover scraps from the larger coffins, noted Silas Hurry. There are hammer marks on the lead. It had served another purpose, perhaps as a tabletop or roof, before it had been turned into a coffin, he added. An unusual find within the coffin posed a puzzle. A layer of soil partially covered the body when the coffin was open, while another layer lay beneath the baby's skull and upper body. It's normal to find soil from the grave shaft inside a coffin. The soil enters as the coffin decomposes, but the lead coffin hadn't decomposed. Even though it wasn't airtight, it had no gaps large enough for grave shaft soil to enter. One of the soil layers consisted of gray soil, the other was brown, so the soil clearly came from different places. Furthermore, both were different from the soil that had filled the grave shaft. Where did they come from, and when? The team considered a theory that the child may have initially been buried only in the wooden coffin that was found within the lead one. Sometime later, the wooden coffin was dug up, placed into the lead coffin, and reburied. The soil could have fallen into the wooden coffin during this process. Another possibility was that the soil had been used to prop the child's head and upper body higher in the coffin prior to burial so that the grieving family members could more easily see the child when they paid their last respects. Given the two separate soil layers, both theories could have been correct. To gather more data, the team sent samples scraped from the surface of each layer to a laboratory for pollen analysis. Pollen, the tiny yellow grains found on the reproductive parts of plants, is produced by different plant species at varying times of the year. Any pollen that was floating in the air at the time the soils were placed in the coffin would have settled onto the surface. Identifying the pollen might therefore help the team determine during what season the soils were placed into the infant's coffin. Gerald Kelso, the team's palynologist or pollen specialist, found that the two soils contained different types of pollen. One soil had pollen from an oak tree, the other had pine tree pollen. These tree species release their pollen at different times during the spring, suggesting that the soils were placed in the coffin at those times. Unfortunately, the soil analysis couldn't tell the team exactly where the soils came from, or how they entered the coffin. Although this question continues to puzzle the team, they believe they figured out the answer to an earlier mystery, that of the baby's missing leg and foot bones. Because the coffin wasn't airtight, it must not have been watertight either. Over time, water droplets had seeped into the coffin and dampened the soil. Gravity pulled the water down through the sanded layer of soil to the area where the baby's lower legs and feet lay. The damp conditions caused the lower leg bones and feet to deteriorate and eventually disappear. The upper part of the skeleton remained intact because it wasn't exposed to as much moisture. Even when a baby's entire skeleton is well preserved, determining whether the child was a boy or girl is almost impossible. The differences in skulls and pelvic bones that forensic anthropologists rely upon for this purpose generally aren't noticeable until a person has reached the teen years or beyond. That said, Owsley could make an educated guess. The lead coffin baby had small teeth and a pointed chin. These factors, plus a wide angle in one area of the hip bone, suggested that the baby was more likely to have been a girl than a boy. Could Owsley and Brulhide discover why the baby had died? As they examined the baby's cranium, they noticed a number of abnormal holes. Some were very tiny, others were as large as 0.2 inches. Abnormal holes of this kind are a sign of a serious disease. They indicate that the child's bones were not forming properly as she grew. One condition that causes abnormal holes like those found in the lead coffin baby's cranium is rickets, a disease resulting from a lack of vitamin D, calcium, and sunlight. Rickets causes unhealthy bone changes in children. For example, the skull bones become thin so they break easily. The ends of the ribs become flared, wider than normal. Other bones become soft enough to bend and bow into abnormal shapes. When Owsley and Brulhide examined the baby's ribs, they found that the ends were flared exactly as one would expect in a child who suffered from rickets. Historical documents show that colonial mothers often kept their babies swaddled, wrapped tightly in cloth. Swaddling would have prevented the baby's body from absorbing sunlight, which, along with poor nutrition, could cause rickets. A second condition called anemia may have contributed to the lead coffin infant's death. Anemia is caused by a lower than normal number of red and blood cells. These cells carry oxygen throughout the body, so an anemic person suffers from an insufficient oxygen in the organs. Anemia can cause several weaknesses, fatigue, and paleness. A common cause of anemia is a lack of the element iron found in leafy green vegetables and meat. In colonial times, doctors believed that people fell ill because their blood had turned bad. Making a cut in the patient's skin to release the supposedly bad blood, a practice called bloodletting, was one of the ways doctors tried to cure sickness. Modern medical doctors know that removing blood weakens an ill person. If the lead coffin baby was bled as her illness worsened, as would have been the custom, she would have become sicker. Owsley and Brulhide are certain that rickets and possibly anemia led to the little girl's death. The lead coffin baby offers clear proof that infants in the colonial Chesapeake were susceptible to many diseases. Given that the baby's family was wealthy, after all, only a wealthy family would be able to bury a child in a lead coffin, it seems likely that she would have spared no expense in her medical care. Even so, by the time she died, the lead coffin baby was a very sick child and had been so for some time. Her death appears to have been the result of her illness. The Lady of the Manor. The remains in the second lead coffin told the story of a much longer life. The coffin, although better made than the baby's, wasn't perfect. Small nicks in the lead sheeting were caused by errors in cutting. The addition of a small lead extension strip showed that the coffin maker was inexperienced at making lead coffins. That's not surprising, since they were uncommon. The body, however, fit perfectly in the narrow inner coffin made of yellow pine, an indication the occupant had been slender. The wooden coffin lid had cracked and collapsed onto the skeleton, damaging several bones in the pelvis. Traces of dried tissue still clung to the individual bones, and a fair amount of fine brown hair covered the skull. Some of the vertebrae showed signs of arthritis. From dental and bone clues, Owsley and Brulehide concluded that the remains belonged to a slender woman, about 5 feet 3 inches tall, who had lived to be at least 60 years old. 3 discoveries confirmed that the woman who prepared this body for burial had treated it with great respect. Remnant strands of linen were still wrapped around some corroded green pins, proving that she had been shrouded. The other 2 pieces were far more unusual. A silk ribbon tied neatly in a bow around the lady's wrist held her hands in place across her waist, and sprigs of rosemary, a strong-smelling herb, were strewn over her body. Rosemary was an herb the English used for remembrance, explained Henry Miller, noting that this custom is mentioned by the character of Ophelia in William Shakespeare's famous play Hamlet, written in about 1599. Traditionally, Europeans and the English placed cuttings of rosemary at weddings and funerals as a reminder to keep people in one's memories. Seeing this ritual continuance on the side of the Atlantic shows how the colonists were trying to follow English tradition, Miller added. As Owsley and Brulehide studied the woman's bones, they noticed that many had lost mass and become thin. Thin bone like these are a sign of a condition called osteoporosis, which results from a lack of calcium in the diet. The bones of people with osteoporosis become brittle and break easily. Much of the time during the last few years of her life, she was in a lot of pain, said Owsley, and she walked with a limp. A quick glance at the lady's right femur was all Owsley needed to make these deductions. The shaft of the bone was enlarged and badly deformed. Several years before she died, she fractured her femur, he explained. When the bone broke, the lower half of the bone twisted and shifted upward. The pain would have been agonizing. When a person breaks a leg bone in this way in modern times, a surgeon realigns the bone correctly and braces it with the metal plate, which is fastened to the bone with screws. A system of cables and pulleys known as traction may be used to maintain the leg in an elevated, immobile position for a short time as the bone begins to heal. In colonial times, the best that could be done was to hold the legs in place with a wood split while the patient rested in bed for several weeks. In the case of the lead coffin lady, new bone had grown in her femur at the area of the break, fusing the 2 broken pieces together. That's how Owsley could tell that she had broken the bone several years before her death. Bone measurements confirmed what was easily visible. Her right leg was about 1 inch shorter than the left, more than enough difference to cause a limp. An irregular bony growth on the femur near the area of the fracture told Owsley that the broken bone was also plagued with an ongoing infection that occasionally flared up, causing the lady additional pain. But the leg wasn't her only problem. She'd lost 20 teeth by the time of her death. Many of her 9 remaining teeth had decayed. Others were worn down to the gum line. The positions of the remaining teeth were such that when she chewed, none of them would have closed together. Furthermore, the roots of these teeth barely held them in place, so it's likely that she could only eat very soft foods. Despite these problems, Owsley didn't find evidence that the woman had tried to take care of her teeth, or at least to make them look better. Her lower teeth, even below the gum line, were marred by a deep hollow that Owsley recognized as evidence of a common method of tooth cleaning. Practitioners wrapped a cloth around finger, dipped it into a gritty paste, and scrubbed the cloth across the surface of the teeth. Unfortunately, the colonial formula for tooth polish was a recipe for disaster. The ingredients of the paste were vinegar, salt, and tobacco ashes, which contained microscopic particles of an element called silicon. Although the intent was to make teeth appear sparkling white, the salt grains, the gritty silicon particles, and the acidic vinegar actually wore away the enamel of a person's teeth. Over time, the scrubbing created a visible, worn area across the teeth. Sometimes this furrow was deep enough to expose the pulp. The treatment undoubtedly contributed to the lead coffin lady's tooth loss. Had she lived a few years longer, all of her teeth would have fallen out. In her final years, the lady would have been malnourished because she was unable to eat a variety of healthy foods. It's likely that she was often inactive and at times bedridden due to the chronic infection and pain in her leg. As if the suffering from these ailments wasn't enough, laboratory tests revealed something even more disturbing. The lady in the laboratory. Laboratory analyses of the lead coffin lady's hair, carried out by Mark Moore at Pennsylvania State University, yielded more information about her life and death. All hair contains trace elements, minerals found in small amounts. Most of these elements, zinc and iron, for example, help us stay healthy. The amount of trace elements in the food and liquids that people eat and drink can affect the levels found in their hair. A strand of hair from scalp to end, therefore, contains a record of the trace elements that the growing hair has absorbed from a person's body. As a nuclear physicist, Moore knew how to use a device called a nuclear reactor to analyze the trace elements in a strand of hair. Much larger nuclear reactors are typically used as an energy source for the generation of electricity. Scientists clipped the woman's hair sample into short lengths and placed them inside the reactor, starting with the segments that grew closest to the woman's scalp. The reactor then bombarded the hair with neutrons. Trace elements that are bombarded with neutrons become radioactive. Radioactive materials emit certain kinds of rays. Each trace element, no matter how small the amount, can be identified by measuring the type and amount of ray it emits. Moore was astounded to learn that the woman's hair contained very high levels of the element arsenic, a deadly poison, and the level of arsenic increased the closer the hair segment was to the scalp. According to Henry Miller, that means that the months before she died, she was consuming more and more arsenic. The woman's bone samples also contained a high level of arsenic, confirming these findings. Had the lead coffin lady tried to kill herself? Had she been murdered? The truth is that she was probably trying to get better, and it may have been her own doctor who suggested she take the poison. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, people mistakenly believed small doses of arsenic could cure certain illnesses. Many medicines actually incorporated arsenic as one of the ingredients. Unfortunately for the lead coffin lady, the very medicine she hoped would cure her aches and pains was in fact hastening her death. In this case, a poverty-stricken person who had wanted to take the medicine but was unable to afford it would definitely have fared better than she did. What might this woman's daily life have been like? Unfortunately, as Henry Miller explained, archaeologists and historians have found little good data about how high-status women lived in early Maryland. Still, they know enough for Miller to make an educated guess. As the lady of the house and a relatively wealthy person, she never would have worked in the fields. She did have a buildup of bone with muscle attachment sites on her upper arms, however. It's certain that she was physically active, Miller continued. She probably did various household chores such as cooking and likely worked in the garden, both female tasks of the period. She may have had a hand in dairying, although milkmaids would have done much of that. The life of the Chesapeake upper class, while far easier than that of those who worked in the fields, wasn't just a life of leisure. The man of the house. The largest lead coffin was the heaviest and most finely crafted of the three. 2 sheets of lead had been fashioned into hexagonally shaped boxes. One had been placed on top of the other so that they fit together in much of the way a shoebox and its lid do. Nails driven through the lead and into the wood coffin held the lid securely in place. The wood coffin inside the lead one was made of several kinds of wood. The lid was so beautifully preserved you could still drive nails into it, said Henry Miller. During the 17th century, when the English buried a husband and wife beside each other, they traditionally placed the husband's grave on the north side of the wife's grave. The large lead coffin was on the north side of the woman's coffin, so the team knew that if the large coffin contained the remains of a man, it may have well been the woman's husband. No one expected what they actually found inside the coffin, though. We were shocked, Miller recalled. From the waist up, most of the bone had been transformed into a white crystalline material. Miller and his team feel certain that the surprising state that the skeleton is a result of embalming. During this burial practice, the organs are removed from inside the body and the skull. When remains were embalmed during the 17th century, the empty body and skull were cleaned and filled with a mixture of salt, a white powder called alum, lime, a substance found in certain types of rocks, and herbs. This mixture preserved the body by slowing down the rate of decomposition. How did the team link the crystal remains to this practice? Geologists identified the crystals found in the coffin as a mineral called brushite. Brushite forms when elements in salt and alum combine with calcium, one of the elements in bone. The brushite was located in exactly the areas where embalming materials would have been placed. Bones in other areas were unchanged. If the team's analysis is correct, the brushite remains are the earliest evidence of embalming in colonial America. Fortunately, the rest of the skeleton had not transformed into brushite. From the waist down, the skeleton was in excellent condition, Henry Miller noted. Even the toenails were there. These bones, along with the teeth found in the coffin, provided Owsley and Brulwahide with enough evidence to conclude that the remains belonged to a male in his 50s who was probably right-handed, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, and, as suggested by the coffin's width, somewhat overweight. His bones showed no evidence that he had worked long hours doing heavy chores. Clearly, like the captain at Jamestown, the lead coffin man had been a gentleman of the upper class. Owsley found no signs of debilitating illness, ongoing health problems, or a severe injury. It appeared the man probably died after a short or sudden illness, such as a fever or a heart attack. He did smoke, however. Owsley puzzled out the facts this way. The man in the grave had 17 teeth. They showed signs of moderate wear and 2 small cavities. The teeth are what told Owsley that the man was a smoker. When pipe smokers repeatedly clamp their teeth on a pipe stem to hold the pipe in place, the edges of their teeth become worn. The worn area are called facets. The wear pattern that the pipe facets create exactly reflects the curve of a pipe stem. The lead coffin's man, pipe facets, proved he was a pipe smoker. Meanwhile, Tim Riordan had found traces of silk ribbon in the area where the man's neck would have been and around each of his wrists. The man must have worn a burial garment other than a shroud. From historical research, Riordan had learned that towards the end of the 17th century, shrouds were often replaced, especially among wealthy people with a long shirt-like garment and a cap with a chin strap. The women who prepared the lead coffin man's body must have thought that he deserved the very best burial garb, yet another indication that he was probably a man of high status. Although the third coffin and its contents had provided much information, the team's hopes of learning about 17th century air were dashed when Miller received the results of the laboratory test on the air sample taken before the coffin was opened. The analysis revealed that the sample was indeed very old, but it also contained chemical components not found in pure air. Miller thinks that these chemicals came from the materials used to embalm the man's body. Even worse, the sample also contained small traces of modern gas that showed that the coffin air had been contaminated before the team sampled it. For these reasons, the team was unable to draw any conclusions from the sample about 17th century air. While the team knew much more about the lead coffin people than when they began their examinations, they hoped they could add one more puzzle piece. Would it be possible to find out the identities of the coffin occupants? Naming the unnamed. That task became a priority for Lois Green Carr, the historian for Project Lead Coffins in St. Mary's City. As she compiled a list of possible names from the historical documents, she kept in mind several facts and theories. Archaeological data told her that the 3 lead coffins were buried between 1667 and 1704, the dates when the chapel had been used. Since the burials were inside the chapel, the people must have been Since the burials were inside the chapel, the people must have been wealthy Roman Catholics who had been important community members. From Owsley and Brulwahide's work, Carr knew the sex of each adult and their approximate ages in the time of death. Because the 3 coffins were buried together, the archaeologists were inclined to believe that the individuals were related. However, the woman's age, at least 60, ruled her out as the baby's mother. A piece of data from the laboratory analysis proved especially useful. The carbon-13 value for the lead coffin man was negative 17.4. The lead coffin ladies was negative 17.1. These 2 people had lived in Maryland, eating corn as part of their diets, long enough for the carbon-13 content of their bones to change accordingly. Carr therefore eliminated from her list of candidates the names of people who had died shortly after their arrival from England. Carr focused her search first on men who fit the criteria. This choice was more likely to produce successful results because Englishmen of the 17th century, far more often than women, were mentioned in legal documents such as land deeds, business transactions, wills, and government papers. Under the law, married women did not have equal status with men, especially in the area of property ownership. Thus, they were seldom mentioned in historical documents, making research about women far more difficult. Carr therefore assembled a list of prominent men of 17th century Maryland, including details such as age, the name of wives, when they had arrived in North America, their occupations and community standing, and where and at what time of year they had died. A small amount of pollen found in the man's coffin indicated that he was buried in the winter, a time when little pollen is floating in the air. Carr's final list included 10 men, but only one, Philip Calvert, perfectly fit all the historical evidence as well as the scientific evidence completed by the project-led Coffin's scientists. Carr's thorough search of the historical record revealed that Philip Calvert was the younger half-brother of Cecil Calvert, the founder of the Maryland colony. Philip and his wife, Anne Wesley Calvert, arrived in St. Mary's City in 1657. Over the years, he served as the governor, the mayor of St. Mary's City, the chief judge, and the chancellor of the colony, all very powerful positions. Philip was a very wealthy man. The historical record indicates that his home, a red brick mansion he named St. Peter's, was the largest colonial mansion in English America in 1678. That makes it a major building, Henry Miller stated. From a 1682 inventory of Philip's property, Louis Carr discovered that Philip had a personal library of more than 100 books, one of the largest libraries in colonial Maryland. This wealth alone would have given him a prominent place in St. Mary's City society, but Philip Calvert was clearly respected for his leadership in the community as well. He was therefore a fitting candidate for a lead coffin burial. While the exact date of Philip's death excluded Carr, she did find a document that narrowed the possibilities to sometime between December 22nd, 1682, and late January 1683. He was 56 years old at the time of his death. In a will dated 1678, Anne Calvert was left a silver watch. Evidently, Carr concluded, Anne must have been alive then, but Philip and his wife Jane, not Anne, signed a deed or ownership paper in March 1681. It seemed equally evident to Carr that Anne had died some time before that date, and that Philip had then remarried. His second wife, Jane Soule, was much younger than he was, probably between 15 and 17 years old when they were married, the average age of marriage for female colonists born in Maryland. Since Anne wouldn't have been too old and too sickly to have been the mother of the baby, in the smallest lead coffin, Carr and Henry Miller think that Jane was the child's mother. Although no documents have been found to confirm that a child from the second marriage, only the child of a very important person, Philip Calvert, for example, would have been qualified for a lead coffin burial. The identification of the remains as those of Anne and Philip Calvert presented the team with another curious puzzle. Anne Wesley Calvert died 2 years before Philip, yet the grave shaft stratigraphy showed they were buried at the same time inside the grave shaft, presumably after Philip died. Where had Anne's coffin been for the intervening 2 years? One scenario is that the entire grave had been dug when Anne died, wide enough for both husband and wife. In this scenario, Anne would have been placed on one side of the shaft, which was left open so that Philip's coffin could be buried inside when he died. Miller doesn't think this is likely, though, because pollen would have sifted into the unoccupied side of the crypt. There was no pollen under Philip's coffin. There was also no evidence that Anne's coffin had been dug up and then reburied beside Philip. Miller is sure that if this had occurred, the lead coffin would have been nicked by whatever tools they were used to dig it up. The coffin had no such nicks, so Anne's coffin must have been stored somewhere. Was it awaiting shipment to England for burial there, but then given a final resting place in the colony when Philip died? So far, the team haven't discovered the answer to that riddle. Still, the shared grave of the lead coffin family has revealed a wealth of information about the lives and death of St. Mary's City most well-to-do residents.